How should business leaders manage and navigate through the many challenges brought on by the COVID-19 outbreak? I'm Ottoman Özilder, Senior Director for Economic Research and Global Research Chair here at the Conference Board. I'll be hosting this episode of Window On. We'll be discussing the impact on businesses and economies of the latest outbreak and the crisis that's brought on by this outbreak. And how can corporations navigate through these challenges? Hello, and thank you for joining us for this Window On webcast. Some of you may be joining us for CPE credits. If you're eligible for that, there are instructions on your screen to obtain those credits. You have to join for the full hour of the webcast. At random points, there'll be pop-ups where you have to click through and you have to let us know your email address in order to get those. You only receive these CPE credits for the live webcast. So today we're going to be talking about the COVID-19 outbreak and the global emergency and crisis that's brought on by that. Financial markets took a big hit this week. Today they seem to be stabilized. Tomorrow is another day as more news comes through. The World Health Organization declared this worldwide public emergency. There are some talk about whether this turns into a global pandemic or not. European countries are seeing the crisis unfold and they're getting ready for that. Under sort of a rapid containment scenario, we might expect the impact of the crisis to be short-lived and create kind of a rebound in business and economic activity after the first quarter, but we're really not sure if that's how things will be unfolding or not. There are a lot of unknowns and uncertainties, and we'll be discussing those and how can businesses manage through and navigate these uncertainties and challenges. So on screen, you see some of the issues that we'll be talking to our panelists today. What are some of the short-term and long-term business and economic implications? For companies, what are some of the implications for how they respond to such outbreaks? Are there strategies that they can use to prepare and manage the disruptions that are brought on by these outbreaks? And are there some possible scenarios we can think of that help you to think of how the crisis will unfold going forward in the next months and the next year? So it's my privilege to introduce today's panelists. And first we have Jude Blanchette, Freeman Chair of China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Hello, Jude. Welcome. Next, we have Dr. Howard Fisher, who is the Chief Medical Officer at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Good morning, Dr. Fisher. Great to have you.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
And last but not least, Alexander Heil is the Chief Economist at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Alex and I are the economists on the panel, and we'll be looking forward to discussing some of those economic implications as well. Hello, Alex.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Great to have all of our panelists here, and our audience knows that if they have questions or comments, they can type those in the pod on the screen. So we welcome those as we go through some of the discussion and the details here. Before we go too far, I'd like to ask my colleagues in the control room to pull up a poll question so we can get some feedback from our audience. So the first poll question should be up on the screen, and that's, in your opinion, which sectors of the economy will suffer the most as a result of the outbreak? And you can check all that apply. Industrial production, electronics manufacturing, retail, catering, tourism, hospitality, transportation, education, or entertainment services. And I see the responses coming in here. We'll give our audience some more time. And once we get the poll question, I'll be asking our panelists, what their responses are to these. Okay, it looks like people are still sorting through, but maybe it's slowing down, so they're making up their minds. Let's close the poll question in about 3 seconds. There are a lot of options there, so I'll try to read off the top choice was tourism, perhaps not surprisingly, and there are also 60%, above 60% for hospitality, transportation, and also electronics manufacturing. The biggest hit for electronics manufacturing in the industrial sector, industrial production is maybe 55%. That's not as much. People see the smallest impact on things like catering, education, and entertainment services. So let me go to the economists on our panel. Alex, what do you think? Is there anything surprising in the way those responses came out?
No, it doesn't surprise me at all that tourism takes the top spot. Tourism, there's a lot of exchange of services, and they count as export of services for whatever country the visitors go to. So I think that's a large share potential. There's a large impact can be felt there, and therefore that could be a direct impact on the economic performance of the host country. And with that is, hospitality is very closely related. So is transportation. So I see those three as really working together here, and that's one of the mechanisms by which an economy can be affected.
Great, thanks, Alex. And Jude, let's go to Washington D.C.
Yeah, just the tourist number is interesting, of course, because Chinese tourists spend, it depends on how you count it, but if we look last year, they spent roughly 250 billion globally. So when we're talking to officials in governments in Southeast Asia and in the Indo-Pacific more broadly, this is an impact that everyone is now feeling as Chinese tourists are staying home. So this is something that economies in Thailand, Japan, South Korea are going to be watching very closely, given the outsized role that the Chinese tourist plays.
And in many economies, services is taking a larger and larger share of economic activities. So this could indeed bring on a big hit for some of those places. Dr. Fisher, any surprises to you in what you heard?
No, there are not. I would expect that tourism to be the number one hit, and hospitality and tourism sort of go together. So I expect the results to be as they're seen.
One thing that did surprise me, however, is education got the lowest votes. And just before the show, we were discussing, whether schools might get notices about the crisis, about reacting to the crisis, and possibility for restricting, school time and closing schools, and that could create a much larger ripple effect for the economy as well. So something to watch out for, but hopefully we're not going to get there. Let me stay with you, Dr. Fisher. So you're a physician in a large human resources organization. How would you approach the news of an outbreak like this? And when epidemics like this come and go, what are the expected trajectories?
Okay. Well, what we do is when I receive notice of any type of emergency that would involve a medical decision. I partner with my external partners, federal, state, city, municipal, the CDC in the state of New York and New Jersey, local municipalities, in trying to gather as much information to be able to give good communication to my senior staff and to the people at the Port Authority on what measures we need to take and deal with. Often it's very difficult to gather that information, and one of my tasks is to make sure that information is accurate and that I can distribute the information without instilling panic in our employees and the traveling public.
Yeah, so you're really emphasizing the role of communication there, and you mentioned it has to be accurate, but it also has to be timely. It seems like there might be a tension there. How do you manage that tension between accuracy and timeliness of the communications?
Well, that's sometimes something that's very difficult to do. I will never release any information that I wasn't absolutely with at least 99% certainty that I was releasing information that was accurate. Today with media the way it is, often media has information before I have it. So it's often we have to calm people down and make sure that people are receiving correct information in a timely manner.
Yeah, thank you. So a recent headline was, after the coronavirus, can the Chinese politics ever be the same? And we could play off that and say, will the Chinese economy ever be the same? And Jude, you follow Chinese economy and the country very closely. What is the immediate impact on business sentiment in China and then in the region? And do you see a big sea change in the confidence in the economy there?
Without a doubt, this is probably one of the most trying times for China's economy, at least since 2008 global financial crisis or the outbreak of SARS in 2002, 2003. There's still just an extraordinary amount of uncertainty in China right now within the economy, despite comments from the Chinese leadership that they've turned a corner over the past week or so. If you just look at outside analysts who are watching the Chinese economy for 2020, I think the range of estimates we could say is from about 4.5% GDP growth in 2020 on the lower side to 5.5% on the more optimistic side. But this is down from around 6% or estimates of 6% just a few months ago. A lot of business confidence is hinging on a so-called V-shaped recovery coming in Q2 or Q3. That's a very optimistic scenario, just looking at the state of play on the ground in China right now. We have not seen a return to normalcy yet, and we're seeing this reflected in some of the earnings calls coming out from U.S. companies who are just not seeing operations return as quickly as they would like. And just looking domestically in China, if you look at the fate of SMEs there, they're really struggling here. There was a recent survey done by the Chinese Association of Small and Medium Enterprises. 60% of companies surveyed, there was about 1,000 companies they surveyed, said they've only got enough cash on hand to make it through one or two more months here because things have really ground to a halt. And only about 10% say they have enough cash to make it six months or longer. And remember that SMEs are responsible for the overwhelming bulk of employment in China. So we've really not seen this bottom out yet, and there's still a great deal of uncertainty. I'll just quickly say on the political front as well, this is very uncertain times. This is, without a doubt, the most significant domestic political test that China's leader Xi Jinping has dealt with. And we've seen some real weaknesses in China's governance system based on how it responded, or more accurately, didn't respond part of a month and a half until January 20th. So this is, even once we get through this, in terms of containing the virus, there's going to be some questions asked in China about how Beijing responded to this. So this is, by a long stretch, this is not over.
So it definitely sounds like an emergency and a crisis that's going to have larger repercussions beyond China, and for the global economy and the relationships between economies and countries as well, I think. Alex, I'll come to you with the question about economies, especially for the regional and the U.S. economy. Do you expect a lot of impact from this? Obviously it's a significant problem for Chinese companies, and do you think that travels throughout the supply chains and we see the repercussions here?
I generally think that there will be repercussions from the coronavirus, and the extent to which it's going to affect the U.S. as well as the global economy. I think we should keep in mind that it's very difficult to come up with a specific forecast and put a real number on this because of the uncertainty, and nobody exactly knows how this is going to play. There have been several estimates that have been sort of published, and Jude mentioned some of those when it comes to the Chinese economy. There have been some, sort of the first quarter effects in the U.S. Are in all expectations quite significant. There are several channels through which the coronavirus outbreak can affect the U.S. and the global economies. And I can talk about those in a second, but it's also important to keep in mind that 2020 is already going to be a year that in all expectation is going to see slightly lower growth than we expected or we had in 2019. Business investment has really slowed or actually grown negatively the last 3 quarters ending the year in 2019. Trade, after the imposition of trade tariffs, has now also seen a decline in volume towards the end of the year. Some parts of the country are more affected than others. Manufacturing arguably is already in recession in the U.S. So, if you're flying close to the top of the trees, it may not take that much to really disrupt your flight path. And so if you look at this from the point of view of the different mechanisms, there's certainly the Chinese production angle of the supply chain, how products are going to be delivered to the United States and how delays in production and shipping are going to be affecting businesses and consumers here. We're already hearing that there might be some delays and cancellation of some shipment services in the very near term. I think currently the expectation is that that's a temporal shift and it will pick up again once the outbreak is contained or nearly over, maybe with some expectation in the summer month. But we don't really know that. Then you can also look at, and I think that's probably one of the larger areas of exposure, certainly in confidence. So it's been the consumer sector that's really propelled the economy forward in 2019. So if we're thinking about what a widespread outbreak, for instance, in the United States would do to consumer sentiment, which is at an all-time high or is very, very strong, then I think that may have a real detrimental effect. So despite a strong labor market, low unemployment, some wage growth that's been materializing in 2019, I think people might just personally feel that they need to retrench. They might get guidance on not being in public places. And I think that can all erode confidence and therefore affect the U.S. economy as a result.
Yeah, I think we're going to be watching the data on shipments and those supply chain relationships pretty closely, because they do give kind of a hint on how widespread or how serious the effects might be. Obviously, a company may not have suppliers from China, but their suppliers might have suppliers from China on the second or third or maybe even the fourth or fifth level down. So there could be a lot of these.
Yeah, just to sort of add to this, that's a very good point. I mean, especially if you're thinking about everybody's waiting for the latest model of the iPhone, and that's being manufactured in various different countries, and maybe the final touches are put on in China before it gets shipped to the United States. And if there's a delay, it doesn't really matter what happened prior, but that will affect the supply chain for that product alone, which is certainly sensitive to an entire sector.
Yeah, I think it does depend also on the duration of how long the problems last. We did hear earlier, a couple of weeks ago, a car manufacturer in South Korea stopped one of their factories. I think another one in Italy was considering that because they couldn't get those parts. But moving along, actually, we do have a question from our audience, and we are fortunate to have Dr. Fisher with us. So I think this is going to be for you, because it's asking, why is the coronavirus causing such concern and quarantine when other viruses, seemingly much more dangerous, have not caused this level of emergency and crisis? I guess some numbers are, there have been 41 million cases of the flu, and everybody gets annual shots for that, and 41,000 deaths in the last 5 months. Dr. Fisher, any thoughts on that?
Yes, well, excuse me. I apologize. Well, coronavirus is it's a novel virus. For which it's started to spread in China at a relatively rapid rate, and where we have over 80,000 cases right now and approximately 27,000 deaths. There is no treatment or vaccine for this. And we're seeing the disease spread from east to west. We see the disease in China, spreading to the Mideast, spreading to Europe now, and eventually will be spreading to the United States. So I think our concern is that since this is a disease that we do not have treatment for, and it's spreading what looks like rapidly right now, we have major concerns with this.
And there seems to be, it's so new that any estimates about the mortality rates, et cetera, have a great deal of uncertainty. So I think the unknowns and the uncertainty cause a lot of concern, whereas some of the more usual cases of the flus and colds we know more about, and there are treatments available. So maybe there is a difference there. The level of uncertainty is really making it difficult for everyone, and also businesses to really gauge their response. So let's move to talk about the business response to the implications that come from such outbreaks. I'll keep with Dr. Fisher. What are some of your thoughts about the appropriate response to such outbreaks? And you're working very closely with your workforce, so you have a lot of sort of hands-on experience there as well. So we'd love to hear your insights on that.
Yeah, our organization and workforce, especially in our aviation department, including the metropolitan airports and our marine terminals, have contact with people from all over the world, and it's we've partnered with all of the health departments, and we've dealt with previous experiences of diseases coming into the airports or into the marine terminals, and because of our strong partnerships with the different health departments, we're able to contain and offer treatment for certain diseases.
Thanks for that. There is another question which I'm not sure you have an answer for, but I'm going to try it anyway, because it says, can the virus be spread from inanimate objects? If not, then couldn't imports from China continue? So there's a medical part of the question, which maybe you can answer.
There's absolutely a part of the question. Recent research is showing that the coronavirus can live on inanimate objects for 7 to 10 hours. The science is not exact. There's no definite number right now, but we do know that it lives on inanimate objects. I believe the problem is in producing those products and getting them shipped here, because the people aren't able to work in the factories in China.
Exactly. That's probably the bigger problem about shipments, because there are no workers going to factories to produce these things or to transport them. So that does create those shipments and supply chain problems. So my next question in terms of responses is about what the Chinese government and Chinese businesses have done. And I'm going to ask Jude for a quick recap. And actually, there is a related question. Maybe I'll blend this in here because you could touch on that in your response. The comment is that, is this also an exceptional problem because of its origination in an authoritative country where there was a lack of data sharing and cooperation with other countries? So Jude, over to you.
Great. Sorry, I was just jotting that down. I think I'll take that first. That way my elephant brain doesn't forget it. This is obviously a really important question and one that is difficult to parse without seeming political. But I think there's two elements of China's response here. One is the initial period, which is from early December, or let's mark it at December 8th, which is when we had the first death in a hospital in Wuhan, which is, again, the provincial capital of Hubei province, till about January 20th. Despite the seeming superiority of the authoritarian political system in terms of mobilization, China's system was relatively quiet on this. There's a couple theses for this. One is, was it quiet because lower level officials in Hubei province and in Wuhan were just so afraid of kicking bad news up to the top guy, Xi Jinping? Or what I think is a more likely cause of this, it was just bureaucratic incompetence. Officials in Wuhan just didn't have their eye on the ball here for reasons of some important meetings that they were planning. But it's just clear, based on their non-reaction, that they hadn't taken seriously the extent of the coronavirus at a key juncture when it could have been further contained. An example of this is, everyone knows that in January at 2 a.m., they announced that there was going to be a citywide quarantine that they didn't actually put into effect until 10 a.m., so 8 hours later. And an estimated 5 million people fled the city, with untold number of those actually now carrying the novel coronavirus to other parts of the system. So the second part of that, though, is starting on January 20th, General Secretary of the Communist Party, China's leader, Xi Jinping, essentially got wind of how bad the problem was, and he gave some orders while on an inspection tour in southern China, basically said, all right, it's time the system now start taking this seriously. And that marks the moment, really, when we saw the full mobilizational capabilities of China's one-party authoritarian system. And since then, we've seen some extraordinary measures to really lock things down, put in place a number of really strict measures, the quarantines, the extensions of public holidays, restrictions on inter-provincial travel. This is a feature of China's authoritarian system which is not as readily available to more democratic systems. I would say, though, that a weakness of this system, as the framing of the question obviously is trying to get through, is there's a high degree of information control in China. What that means is you had some independent media authorities in early January who were trying to report from Wuhan about what was happening, but they were shut down, essentially, or really constricted in what they could report. And we don't know how what the cost of that censorship was in terms of a possibility of getting a jump start on this, or having the media jumpstart the political response. So I'm trying to avoid making a more clear-cut condemnation on China's system. But I would say, on the whole, a democratic system with open and free media and a highly professionalized public health system like the United States has, seem to give advantages that, again, on the whole, China's system doesn't have. Long answer to a really short but important question. I'll just quickly touch on the Chinese government response and how companies are reacting to this. The benchmark here is SARS, 2002, 2003. It took China a very long time, months, in fact, to actually admit there was an issue. They clearly learned a lot since then, and the public health system has modernized. The political system hasn't, which caused some of the problems I mentioned previously, but certainly in terms of the public health professionals, it's a much better updated system from where it was in 2002. In addition to those quarantine measures that I mentioned and some of the containment measures, now the focus is on the economy. And so you see regulators and local governments really laying out a broad swath of measures, including tax cuts, cheaper borrowing rates, incentives to keep workers employed even if they're not actually going into the workplace. China's Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission has asked lenders essentially have a higher threshold or tolerance for non-performing loans. Basically, they understand that there's a cash repayment crunch, and so if they have rigid expectations on lenders in terms of keeping or looking askance at non-performing loans, it's going to really grind up the system. So they're asking for tolerance. You see Hubei province waiving the value-added tax for smaller firms and lowering the tax to 1% from 3% for small firms throughout the country. But this is, and I'll just make one final point, this is really a crucial phase for China because it's trying to do two things at the same time. It recognizes now we're really starting to feel the economic pain here. Estimates for Q1 growth are going to be pretty dismal. All the estimates coming in are sub 3, I would say, sub 3% for Q1, which is going to mean to hit its growth targets, China's going to have a heck of a Q2 through 4. So they're trying to essentially get the economy back up to normalization and this is the key, the same time they want to maintain the victories or the wins that they're having on the containment of the virus. And those two don't necessarily work together. That if you really push for normalization of the economy, you now have these threat vectors as you have workers, many of whom will still be infected with the virus or potentially affected given the ability to have the virus and to be asymptomatic. So this is going to be a key thing to watch over the next, I would say, 2 to 3 weeks as China tries to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Right. Thanks, Jude. There are obviously sort of very complicated layers and complexities, and that helps us to maybe think through a little bit and understand them better. You mentioned the economic side of things, and in terms of managing the health crisis, perhaps they did learn from the SARS outbreak in 2003. But coming to the economic implications, the Chinese economy and the world economy was a very different place in 2003. China's share was about 4%, and now it's up to 20%. The global value chains are much more globally integrated, and there are many more preventive measures. So on this question, actually, I'll go to Alex. And do you expect some of those preventive measures that the government is putting in place, like extending the holiday and keeping people away from the factory floors, do you think those would be significant enough to have an impact beyond China for the US and the global economy? And related to that, actually, there's one way that those effects could carry on to the global economy, and the question points to that. What would be the outlook for oil and gas be in that context?
So just to clarify your question, you mean the measures that the Chinese government has taken, what the effects would be on the economy?
Yes, do they have a large impact, or do they worsen the impact of the crisis on both the U.S. and the world economy?
Yeah, I think we need to all recognize that some of these measures are fairly far-reaching. I think these quarantines, they covered large, percentage of the labor force, especially in the province that was mostly affected. So if we're looking at some of the production activity as it comes out of there, I think that's a huge factor in terms of the trickle-down effect. I think you're absolutely right. Compared to 20 years ago, the global economy is a different one today than it was back then. So we're much more integrated. We're much more depending on these flows of goods, services, and capital around the world. And I think especially this year, it's the expectation that some of the tariffs might have been, removed, and that we're sort of moving into a better place when it comes to that. So now some of these effects that we're feeling now, they will affect the economy adversely. I think it's hard to tell how, specifically that's going to happen. I mean, if we're looking at the current environment, it's in concentric circles around China. I think the effects get less and less the further out we go. We still don't have a large outbreak in the US, even though experts talk about this being very likely at this point. once that happens, then I think we're sort of in a different place here. In terms of oil and gas, if I saw this correctly, a day or so ago, the price for West Texas Intermediate crude is down to just around just a little north of $50 a barrel, if I remember that correctly. So prices have come down. Equity valuations for companies in the oil and gas space have come down over now really a little longer period of time. If demand continues to fall, if the economic growth, as Juice suggested, for China is going to be anywhere around 3% in the first quarter of 2020, I think that's going to take further demand away from oil and gas, as energy prices are going to slowly come down further than they are currently at. And then I think it will, considering this is probably not a situation that's going to resolve itself very slowly, I would expect that it's not going to turn into a V-shaped recovery where in the second quarter of this year, everything is back to normal. The economy is back, growing at the same pace that it was in 2019. I think some of these effects, they take a while to work their way out of the system. I think especially small firms have felt disproportionately so this liquidity crunch in China. Some of the measures that are thought about and being implemented to a certain extent in China might help that sector, but I think it will. There are negative consequences there, and I think it's hard to see that this is going to just correct itself from one week to the next. I think this is something that is going to take a while for it to come back to a place. But we might not have seen the bottom yet. Obviously, these infections, the numbers keep growing. We're up north of 80,000 now, and those are just the known cases. So we'll have to see. But I would expect that we're really just at the beginning of some of these economic impacts.
Right. So here at the conference board, when we were looking at our outlook, we were thinking that these 2 weeks ending this week, the last 2 weeks, were very critical to really assess whether we would get a V-shaped rebound or whether this might last longer. And it certainly looks like we'll be talking about the issues and trying to get a handle on that. And looking at how confidence evolves, how some of those important indicators like oil prices evolve going ahead. Let's shift a little bit to talk about strategies that businesses have to prepare for and manage the impact of such outbreaks. And again, we're going to go to our audience with a poll question. So I'll ask my colleagues to put up the poll question there. Has your organization done any of the following? And you can check all that apply. Institute new business travel policies. Implement virtual or remote working for your workforce. Create a multifunctional supply chain crisis team to enable agile and real-time decision making. Dedicate resources to understand diverse and rapidly changing local regulations. Establish a rapid response communication channel with your supply chain staff. Sort high-risk shipments. Revisit contingency plans. Set up a dashboard to monitor the unfolding geographic profile of the crisis. Create transportation workarounds. That could be for your workforce or for your supply chain. Or cancel travel plans. We've already talked about some of these responses. So our audience is voting on these. And I apologize, we give you so many options, but there are a lot of sort of complicated issues to deal with. So let's give the audience a little bit more time here. Okay, let's maybe 3 seconds and we'll close. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so it looks like the first option gets the highest votes. Institute new business travel policies. That's probably the quickest thing that companies can do. And canceling business travel is another one that's close to that. That is followed by revisiting contingency plans. Many businesses have business continuity plans, contingency plans, and it's definitely time to revisit that. And implementing virtual and remote working is another one that gets a lot of votes. The others are followed, way down to 20, 25, 28%, establishing rapid response communication channels. I think a lot of the issues that we've kind of brought up are there. Let me go to the panel here. Are there any surprises to you in these responses, or how would you have responded? Let me start with Jude.
Yeah, so this is, as we were talking about before we went live, obviously our travel to China is now has now been canceled. We're supposed to be there next week. This is I think this is the easiest step that folks can take, which is simply to put in place policies and cancel existing trips. The thing that I'm curious about, and folks on the call I'd be curious about as well, is how is this black swan event of the coronavirus, which has taken us by surprise almost at every stage, both in terms of how quickly it spread within China, and I think over last weekend, this moving from being primarily a China story with spillover effects to now a global story. How is this making us, to the point about revisiting contingency plans, I'd be curious about how these are now being revisited and in what way, because this is just another indication of, as we're having this discussion on, decoupling of the U.S. and China economy or tech ecosystems, there's important areas that you can never decouple from, even if you want to, and a global virus is one of those. So in this now increasingly interconnected world, how are we rethinking what the outer bounds of a contingency plan should encompass?
Interesting. Alex, any comments on these poll responses?
No, I think these, the results are fairly intuitive. I feel like as a sort of first order of response, canceling travel, having new travel policies, that seems to make sense. In terms of the longer perspective, and this webcast is a great illustration of that. I mean, we're all in different locations. We have a large audience connecting from all over the place. So I think this remote working, virtual interaction is something that was already a trend, and an event like this can certainly speed this up, the push towards that goal. I think what I'm wondering about is to what extent companies have already thought through their supply chains last year. I think that because of we speak a lot to importers of various goods and services. I remember last year speaking to an importer of toys and children's toys, and the person told me that, now with the tariffs, basically the prices that we have to pay are higher, so we had to really go through our supply chain, see where we can find products that we can then import, where we may not be hit by the high level of tariffs that are imposed on Chinese goods. So I'm wondering to what extent, some business entities have already started to think about their supply chain. So, I mean, everybody is not fully prepared for an event like this, but I think there's probably been some attention paid to this already.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And this is almost like it should be an ongoing concern to revisit those contingency plans on an ongoing way. You don't want to wait for the crisis to pull those off the shelf and dust them off. Let me go to Dr. Fisher. As you think about how businesses respond and some of those strategies, do you think of any mistakes that we should avoid as we implement those?
Well, I think the mistakes to avoid are lack of preparation and lack of communication to our staff. At the Port Authority, we have a dedicated group of people that, including our Port Authority Police Force, our Office of Emergency Management, our Occupational Health and Safety Department, that work together in doing different types of tabletop exercises and full-blown exercises so that we'd be prepared for these type of emergencies.
Yeah, of course, the Port Authority is a very big organization, and you're at the front lines dealing with, interacting with the larger public and the economy. So I think that's a very sort of key position. So thank you for those comments. Before we leave this segment, any other final remarks about business strategies or implementing those strategies? Jude?
Yeah, I mean, this is Jude. I would say just from looking specifically at the angle of companies who have a heavy presence in China, this should always be on the agenda, but I think especially now is obviously as you're attending to some of the issues we were just talking about in terms of supply chain vulnerabilities, obviously employee safety being first and foremost for anyone you have on the ground there. I would say that this is a opportune time. That's maybe not the right word, but this is a moment where I would be reaching out and extending a hand to the Chinese government to see what you can do in terms of any of the capabilities that you have in China. Obviously not exposing employees to risk and threat, but whether that's information sharing or data sharing in ways that are helpful in terms of purely the public health issue here, right? And obviously you have to bound these to make sure you're not getting into any other concerns. But these are moments where China has a long memory, or the Chinese government has a long memory. They remember companies that are in ways that they can helping, and they remember companies that aren't. So I would just say purely from a kind of not only a human element, but from a a government relations element, that would be something I would be suggesting.
Interesting. So there are a couple of comments here that I think are important to weave into the conversation here. Beyond China, this company is having to pull back on travel on many other hotspots, and their employees would like them to pull back. So they are responding to their workforce, and it points to the fact that it's not a one-way communication from senior management to employees and the workforce, but they are listening to their workforce as well and responding with such policies. So that's very interesting to note. And another comment says that they'll be re-examining the business continuity program, which in the past has focused on climate, weather, power outages, so more sort of natural events. So they're kind of expanding that business continuity perspective. So thank you for sharing those comments with us. And I should say that the responses to the poll question are not things that we made up. Those are the sort of the culmination of the work that our Asia research team did at our China Center with our members to look at what businesses are doing. So that is those are the options that came out. So not surprisingly, they're very intuitive and common sense. So we are getting to the end of the hour, and our last topic is kind of to think about some of the scenarios that might come about as the crisis unfolds. Once again, we're going to pull up our poll question to ask our audience what they think about the possible scenarios about how the crisis will unfold. So let's look at that poll question. Fewer answers this time. Short-term blip with little business impact. Short-term dip with business impact in China but not globally. Medium-term dip with significant business impact globally. And the last option is long-term economic downturn with geopolitical consequences. And some of those we talked about. So it looks like today, and with this discussion, we've ruled up the V-shaped recovery rebound scenario there, and there's no responses to that. And we can close in about 3 seconds. I guess it looks like the responses are settling in. And I lost my view of the responses. So maybe the control room can put up the responses again. I think that's the wrong poll. Okay, they're bringing this up for us to see the responses. It looked like the third option was getting the most responses. So it'll be a bigger problem for the economy with implications globally. The fourth option with the longer term seems more severe, and I'm not sure if we're quite there yet, but it might depend on how long this lasts. Well, while they're dealing with the technical issues, let me go to our panelists. And what do you think about what scenarios might unfold or might be most realistic? Alex, what do you think?
Well, I think that I look at this again from the perspective that 2020, in my expectation, was already going to be a relatively weak year when it comes to economic growth. For a while we had an inverted yield curve in sort of up till the late summer of last year or so, the fall. And that was sort of one of the indicators that well, maybe 2020 is even going to see an outright recession, even though the probability of that was really taken down then when we came to the end of the year and the turn into 2020. So what I think is quite likely is that this will affect growth quite significantly. I think if the current projections on the course of the infections is correct, then we'll see many more cases in the U.S. and Europe, and I think that will affect growth going forward. Independent of what happens to production and supply chains, I think there are going to be effects in those economies, certainly via travel, via confidence, via spending that have those kind of effects. And so I think the other question then is, and maybe Dr. Fisher is better to in a position to address that, is to what extent this is going to be a one-off kind of a thing. So is this once the outbreak is under control and then the caseload dies down, is this going to be a periodic, a cyclical, similar to the seasonal flu that will come back with some regularity, or is this a one-time effect? So maybe it's going to be replaced by something else. I'm completely speculating here, but just to focus on the economic impact, it seems likely that 2020 is going to be pretty significantly affected. In that a quick resolution is somewhat more unlikely based on my read.
So I would like to pick up on Alex's question to Dr. Fisher, but I think there are two parts to that question. So after a while, does this become like the seasonal flu? With the COVID-19 becomes a seasonal flu and it keeps coming back every year? Is that one scenario? But I was also hearing it a little bit differently. Are we seeing more such epidemics and outbreaks now in a more globalized world? Do you have a sense of that?
Well, I think that we're starting to see a much more frequent diagnosis of novel viruses because we're able to diagnose them at a more rapid rate. The overall impact it's very hard to predict how this virus will act. Is this virus going to be something that's going to, like you said before, is it something that's going to peter out, we're never going to see this again? Or is it going to be something that is going to maybe sit in the background and we'll have treatment for it, so we'll be able to better contain the virus and be able to treat the virus? We're such at a point right now where we're at the beginning of COVID-19, and making predictions would be very difficult.
Yeah. So, but to follow up on that, how would we know that we're leaving the crisis behind? Do you have any guidance on that? What would you look at to see if the crisis is ebbing?
Well, we look at numbers. We see, actually, if you look at the numbers in China reported over the last 48 hours, we see the numbers starting to become more stable and possibly even showing a slight decline. The way that the Chinese government had reported the number of cases in the beginning was numbers that were constantly increased at a normal rate of increase, and then all of a sudden they would come up with 2,000 cases the next day. And so it was very hard to determine if the numbers that they were giving us were accurate numbers, and how do you look at, is the disease getting much worse at a rapid rate, or is it having a normal incline in disease? Once we start seeing the disease plateauing and the numbers start coming down, then we'll be able to start to predict what, when, and how the disease is going to start ending in the population.
Thank you for that perspective, Dr. Fisher. So let me go back to Alex, and then we'll follow up with Jude on the same question. What would need to happen to see confidence in the economy come back for investors in financial markets, but also for business leaders? What needs to happen for economic confidence to return?
Well, I think confidence hasn't completely left. I think we also need to think about, what kind of, if we're just taking the stock market as an indication here, we're still looking at, despite 2 days where, we were down 6.3% Monday and Tuesday of this week. But, at the end of the day, we're still talking about fairly healthy valuation. So I wouldn't describe that as a situation where confidence has completely disappeared. The same happens with households. I think households in the US in particular feeling more confident now about their prospects, having seen some wage increases, and that's reflected in some of the spending data. I think the main area where confidence has been eroding is in the business investment, on the business investment side, on the corporate side. And I think that's maybe slower to recover now. So I think it's a question of how much confidence is going to take a hit as a result of the coverage here of and the events that are going to unfold here over the next weeks or maybe months. And then, from the business sector, there might also be at that point, sort of, even if the virus is contained and no more additional infection cases are materializing, then maybe it's a question of, it's also an election year in the US. So, let's wait and see. It's already early summer. Now this has been resolved, but now we're waiting and see what's going to happen politically. So confidence is a tricky indicator, but I would think that as of right now, we'll have to really see the first quarter data to see how much the economy has already taken a hit.
So we should be cautious in interpreting those numbers. There are very few of them, and we should be watching that pretty closely. And Jude, how about you? What do you think about confidence in the economy, whether it will get better or worse?
Yeah, and kind of very quickly, because obviously we're going to have to see where we see Q1 come in. But if I'm watching this externally and I'm trying to get an accurate sense of where China stands on this, beyond looking at some of the numbers that Dr. Fisher mentioned in terms of what the death tolls or new cases, two things would stand out for me. One is Chinese government just postponed its spring meeting of the National People's Congress. That's when they approve the annual budget. That's when they come out with the government work report, and crucially, that's when they'll come out with the GDP target for the year. When they give a date for that will indicate that they actually fundamentally believe like they've got the situation under control. A second thing I would be watching for is the movements of Xi Jinping. He's not been to Wuhan. He's been sending deputies down there, I think because he's smart enough to know you don't stick your head out until you know you've got the problem under control. If we see Xi make a trip out of Beijing into Wuhan, that would, to me, beyond the numbers, which we don't have much faith in a lot of Chinese data, that would signal fundamentally like they feel like they've got the coronavirus contained. The second big question, which we'll be watching all year, is what does the shape of the recovery look like in China? And it's too early to tell because we don't know where the bottom is yet.
Right. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are at the end of the hour. I'd like to thank our panelists on this very important discussion about the business and economic implications of the coronavirus COVID-19 outbreak. And thank you, Alexander Heil and Dr. Fisher from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And thank you, Jude Blanchett at CSIS. Thanks for your sharing your insights there. For our audience, if you want more information about this, the Conference Board has been collecting some resources and recent reports. You can click on the link there. And also, if you enjoyed this webcast, next month we're going to be talking about digital tax, a very different topic there with our chief economist, Bart Van Ark. And finally, you can find a podcast on our website. We have done a series of podcasts on the issue of the coronavirus outbreak. So you might hear those podcasts from different perspectives of the business functions. With that, thank you for joining. I'm Ottoman Özyıldırım with the Conference Board.